Support comes from Soaring Heart Natural Beds, where concern for the health and safety of sleep now extends to everything from curbside pickup and delivery to secure in-store appointments. Showrooms in Seattle, Bellevue, and now in Edmonds, or online at soaringheart.com.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. It's been 20 years since Seattle's last big earthquake. If you don't have a plan yet, you need one. Either way, stick around. In a minute, we'll talk about why it's so hard to get prepped, even here in earthquake country, and a few things you can do to get started. But first, let's get you caught up. Seattle brings some students back to school this week. About 1,000 special ed students and preschoolers return on Thursday. Teachers start 3 days of safety training today. Well, that's the plan. The teachers union has filed unfair labor complaints over the district, tagging 600 educators as essential to get them back into the classroom. The union also voted last week to stick with remote learning and voted no confidence in the superintendent to bring teachers back safely. Friday will be 1 full year since students were sent home. Washington inched closer to a new tax on capital gains over the weekend, narrowly passing the state Senate by 1 vote. The proposed 7% tax on the sale of stocks and other valuable assets would add $500 million a year to state coffers. Opponents argue it's an illegal income tax and are promising a court challenge if it becomes law. And is Seattle feeling empty? It's not just the quarantine. The Seattle Times did the math on change of address data from the U.S. Postal Service and found that the number of households in the city shrunk by about 7% last year. Most of those people went to other places in Washington. Bellevue, Shoreline, and Kirkland picked up a lot of ex-Seattleites. On the newcomer side, San Francisco and New York were the top 2 cities sending people here.
The big rattle in Seattle. A strong earthquake strikes the Pacific Northwest.
It felt like the whole building was rocking, the floors were shaking, the stairwell was coming apart.
20 years ago, give or take a couple of days, the 6.8 Nisqually quake shook Seattle. And I remember it because it was the only earthquake I've ever been in. I was in a parking garage and I panicked and I got in my car and started driving. Today, I have that memory, but what I don't have, and I'm guessing you might not either, is a preparedness plan for the next earthquake. We get a big one here every 500 years or so, and the city is built across a major fault, if you haven't heard. You would think that would be enough for people, no? But somehow it is a chore to take even the simplest steps to improve our odds for riding out that big quake. Why can't we do this? Dr. Lucy Jones is here to help us. She's an earthquake researcher in Southern California and the founder of the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, which focuses on earthquake risk reduction. Hey, Lucy, thanks for taking the time.
Glad to be here.
So I want to let you in a little bit on the behind the scenes of this podcast. My producers and I were talking about actually not doing this show because the anniversary of the Nisqually quake was like more than a week ago. And we're like focused on the news cycle. And maybe the news cycle has already blown past the Nisqually quake. And I am guessing that this might be part of the problem.
It is. We do respond to what's happening now. You know, news is the most extreme. Give it a couple days and it's gone. It's why we can't comprehend that this pandemic is actually a great disaster, because it's been going on for too long. We lose track of all that's happened. But in addition, when we look at disaster planning, you need to have memories of it. And if it's not your personal memory, it better be pretty big for you to think about it. You know, if you had a magnitude 8 every 10 years like they do in Japan, you have building codes that handle magnitude 8s.
Okay, so here's where some details might help us out a little bit then. Remind us about the risks of that major earthquake here in Seattle. What can we anticipate? Give me the scenario I might encounter.
Let's talk about 2 different earthquakes. There's the subduction zone. There's the magnitude 9. It will actually be less strong shaking than when the Seattle fault goes right underneath you. That'll only be a magnitude 7, but it'll be right beneath you. In that earthquake, you'll be thrown to the ground. In the big subduction zone earthquake, the accelerations will be smaller, but they won't end. To be a magnitude 9, the fault has to be many hundreds of miles long. We're talking about a rupture from Cape Mendocino in Northern California up to British Columbia. And the fault has to rip. It doesn't all move at once. It's like tearing a piece of paper. You start at one end and rip across. That process takes about 6 minutes, probably for the length of your fault. That means the earthquake goes on for over 6 minutes. It means the shaking never ends. There's some really interesting recordings you can get.
Hey, boy. Woo-wee. That's a good one. Hey, boy, oh boy, oh boy.
Of the Alaska earthquake, the 1964 Great Alaska Earthquake, magnitude 9.2, 7 minutes of shaking. And there's a recording out there of some man who was writing to his daughter, but he didn't like to write. He's an old guy. And so he made a tape on, like, you know, those 9-track tape sort of things.
Hey, that's an earthquake for sure. Woo.
And he was making a tape for his daughter, and he keeps on narrating through the earthquake.
Man, everything's moving. You know that stuff, all the cabinets have come open? And woo-wee. Kids are all out of me, man.
And over and over, you know, when's this going to stop?
Oh, man. I'm telling you, I have never lived through anything like this before in my life.
You know, and a few expletives. What the hell is it keeping on going?
Man, I'm telling you, that's the worst thing I've ever lived through.
And it's a really, it's a great way to experience what that's like.
Oh, boy, I'm telling you, that's something I hope I don't go through again very often.
And that's your experience, right? That's what it'll be for that big subduction zone.
Wow. I'm just listening to you talk about even more than a minute of shaking, and having been through the Nisqually quake, which was under a minute of shaking, I could tell you that was the longest 45 seconds of my life.
I think it was about 15 seconds that the earth was producing energy, and this will be 6 minutes that the earth is producing energy. Now, some of that's going to be coming to you from California, right? Northern California. It won't be strong, but it just won't end.
We're talking about personal preparedness here, and not the things that government ought to be doing. We have regulations and lots of seismic retrofitting going on. But the Texas power outages are so top of mind right now because they're the latest reminder that in a disaster, you're on your own for a bit. And I'm curious, what do I absolutely need to have? What is the difference between having something and not having it?
Probably the most important thing to have is a plan with your neighbors. You say you're going to be on your own. No, the government isn't going to be able to help because it's stretched too thin, but your neighbors are still there. And we see that communities that have what they call high social capital, where people know each other and interact, recover better. And I'd say before you do anything else, go talk to your next door neighbor about it. And maybe your whole block, and start moving from there. Or maybe your church or your school, and maybe your church gets together with the synagogue down the street. And then you start having a network to get this through. If you want to go back to what you were originally trying to get me to say, I think the single most important thing to have is water. Because pipes break in earthquakes. We know that. It just keeps on happening. And our pipes are old and brittle things, and nobody wants to invest in something you can't see. And our estimate for California, I've never seen it for Seattle, but we estimate it'll take 6 months to get all of the pipes in the ground repaired and water back into every house.
Lucy, all of this is both comforting and panic-inducing at the same time. I'm sure you've heard this before, but I'm going to be honest. After we're done with this interview, I am probably not going to run out and do my earthquake prep. I love the neighbors idea. Help me motivate to get this done.
That's probably the hardest part. You know, it's really easy to put off. The other thing about the neighbors is if you're doing it together, it's more interesting. So we actually, I have this nonprofit center, and we just completed a project to develop what we call a community resilience framework, a program where community organizations that want to work together to be ready can connect, figure out what resources they have, how they can help each other, how they're going to communicate. And We just finished it up as a plan. We were doing the pilot when the pandemic shut us down. But the community we were working with told us that because they'd already got those connections, they were getting through the pandemic better. So you can do it for the earthquake, and it's there for all the other disasters as well. It'll be available through my nonprofit in a couple of months once we finish all the cleanup.
Dr. Lucy Jones. She's a seismologist at Caltech and founder of the Dr. Lucy Jones Center for Science and Society, which focuses on earthquake risk reduction. Check out her book, The Big Ones, How Natural Disasters Have Shaped Us and What We Can Do About Them. She also has a podcast called Getting Through It. You can check that out. We'll put it in our show notes. Dr. Jones, thanks so much for talking with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a great discussion.
Seattle Now is produced by Jason Pagano, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Clare McGrane. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.